Mima Amelia Hardvickson, known as Millie, was the second wife of David Crookston. I have some recordings from Marilyn Crookston, Linnell Glenn, and Luana Jensen, all three granddaughters of Millie. I will have them give their description of what they remember of Millie. First Marilyn, then Luana, and then at the end, Linnell.
This is Marilyn, and I thought that perhaps I ought to add a little to what Nell has said. I remember Grandma was short, and she wore her hair back in a bun, always neat, always meticulous. She took pride in herself. Grandma was a wonderful cook, and she used her old wood-burning stove to prepare all her meals. And I could remember how I just loved to eat her warm brown bread with honey on it. She was very industrious, making delicious meals every day, and they were always from scratch. She made head cheese, she made soup and soap, and just you name it, she could make it. And she made delicious pies. She also could sew. Grandma made me several dresses, and I can remember the one that she made me that had a metallic thread in it. And when I wore it, it just about itched me to death. But I dearly appreciated all she did for me. Grandma kept a very clean house. I can remember the big brown chair in the front room and the covered desk. And Grandma always had a candy dish that was full with treats. Grandma always walked with Grandpa across the street to the church, and they were always at church on Sunday. And she was very active in Relief Society also. I remember the outhouse at the back of the home there, and I also remember the chamber pot upstairs. Speaking of upstairs, one night I stayed with Grandma, and I was sleeping upstairs, and a terrible noise woke me up in the middle of the night. And I laid there in bed, and I become so frightened that I grabbed my clothes and I ran home. Come to find out, it was Aunt Carrie snoring. Now Aunt Carrie was Grandma's sister. I have many fond memories of Grandma and Grandpa in the home and the yard. They always had good apple trees, chickens, pigs, and oh yes, I can't forget the mean turkey.
Grandma and Grandpa Crookston lived across the street from the Harm Second Ward Church. When I was a child, Grandfather was a janitor at the church, and he would take my brother Reed and myself over to the church while he cleaned it. I remember spending a lot of time playing the piano there. Their house faced south with a living room and a bedroom in the front and a front porch. The kitchen was on the northeast and a pantry on the west side. A root cellar was behind the house and fruit trees on the west side. The wood pile and chopping block were behind the house. East side also had the outhouse. The barn and outbuildings were on the north of the property. A large garden was on the east. Uncle Jess's house was on the same block east of Grandpa's, and he had a nice garden too. The house had an upstairs and 2 bedrooms and a long stairway. Grandma would dry corn outside on a table covered with metal screen. After the corn had dried, she would put it in bags and hang it down the stairway, or over the stairway. Grandma was a good cook. She made the most delicious pies, mostly raisin, rhubarb, gooseberry, apple, and pumpkin. I used to help her churn butter. I never liked the buttermilk, though, and I did not even try the head cheese that she made. Everything else was delicious: cured hams, lots of fresh and canned fruits and vegetables. She was a good seamstress. My folks did not have much, and Grandmother made dresses for me out of some of her old dresses. They fit nicely and looked quite new. Grandma was also very neat. Everything was put in its place. This is Mother's words. Mother's Helen said, when I was 6 years old, my dad and mother went to Logan. He borrowed the neighbor's horse and fancy buggy. As he was going over the Logan Bridge, there were some people shoveling gravel under it. It rattled the bridge. The horse became frightened, and it ran a couple of blocks right into a telephone pole and left the buggy at the pole, and the horse went on. My mother's head hit the post and split it open. Her leg was broken in 2 places up by the hip. She was in the hospital for a long time. They brought her to the hospital, and her one eye was right out of the socket. They operated and put the eye back, and she could see out of it all right after that. But she always had a little scar on her forehead, and she was always lame. 6 weeks after, she had had her leg set with a bucket of rocks tied onto her leg. She laid flat on her back for 6 weeks, and she used to sew, even laying flat on her back. She would sew things for us kids. All this time, Dad was good to us. 6 weeks later, Mother decided to go to church. We had a little irrigation ditch in front of the home, and the sidewalk had a narrow bridge on it. It had been raining. Mother came along on her crutches, and she slipped on that bridge. Her leg was broken back in the one break. After that, Mother always had a stiff leg. She could never bend her knee. It was always stiff and made her limp. She never missed anything and did her own work. No one had to wait on her after she was able to get around again. She lived to be 72 years old. She had 4 strokes, but came out of them all except the last one when she finally died. And then I said, I can remember when Grandma had one of her strokes. It was on the night that Uncle Bill and Aunt Bessie had their wedding reception in the evening at Grandma's house. They had strung-colored electric lights outside on the lawn. That was in June 1935. Grandma had the stroke during the reception, and needless to say, it ruined the festivities. Now this is again from Helen Jensen's taped interview. They had to put Mother to bed right in the room where they had the trousseau put up. She had her first stroke when she was 52 years old, and they always said there were hopes until you were over 60. The last one she had was in her 70th year, and she lived to be 72 years old. She was in bed for a long time. We would take turns going to the home and taking care of her. I'd go up there and stay 3 or 4 days, and then Jenny would come and stay 3 or 4 days until she died. Mother died just a year and a half before Dad died. He was so lonesome and didn't know how to do anything. Mother had always done all the work, and nobody could do it good enough to suit her. Even when she was dying, she would raise up from her bed and tell Jenny or me that we were putting some of her things in the wrong drawer in her bedroom. Dad stayed with Phyllis and Jess most of the time. He died on 13th of March, 1948 at Jenny's home in Wellsville, Utah, at the age of 86, and was buried in the Logan Cemetery on the 16th of March, 1848. See, wait a minute.
She had a stroke. I don't know how old I was then, but I remember Mama and her sisters took turns and went and stayed with Grandma, and she kept having problems and trying to tell them what she wanted because she couldn't talk plain at that time. And she wanted a box that was in her closet that was an Epsom salts box. Now, if anyone didn't know, that was physic we took in those days. And they didn't want her to have it because they didn't want her to have that problem too. So they went through a lot, and finally one day my mother just went and got the box and gave it to her because they were all tired of listening to her. And she took the box and took the lid off and dumped it on the bedding, and in the bottom she had saved $300 to bury her. And back in those days, $300 was a lot of money, and they didn't know how she'd ever manage that.